Today we're back with another, more editing-intensive compilation. This time we've got a fully mixed down full hour of the best Zelda-related cut content and unused ideas from the main DYKG channel. If you like this more heavily edited approach, do us a favor and give this video a like, and subscribe if you want more. But enough of the preamble, let's get to the trivia.
Did you know? Originally, Ocarina of Time ran on the same engine as Super Mario 64, and both games were even developed concurrently. However, Ocarina's engine was so heavily altered by the end of development that its co-director, Shigeru Miyamoto, considers them two completely different engines. This concurrent production reflected how the original Mario and Zelda games were made alongside each other and shared ideas. Concepts were also traded between Ocarina and Mario 64, such as horse riding, which was actually planned for Mario 64. Miyamoto initially intended the game to have a first-person perspective, with the camera switching to a side-on or third-person perspective while sword fighting. This first-person perspective would show off more of the game's terrain, and allow the team to focus on developing enemies and environments rather than Link's appearance. The concept was abandoned when young Link was introduced, as Miyamoto believed a third-person view would help highlight the differences between young and adult Link. In an Iwata Asks interview, Miyamoto explained that in order to conserve memory, he initially planned the entire game to be set within Ganon's castle. The castle would serve as a hub world to enter other areas, much like Princess Peach's castle in Super Mario 64. And in a worst-case scenario, Link might not have left the castle at all. Did you know that Miyamoto was originally going to have the ranch burned to the ground in Ocarina of Time? So let's jump right into it with a Shigeru Miyamoto interview all about Ocarina of Time's development from 64 Dream Magazine's January '99 issue. Miyamoto mentions how he only joined the Ocarina team sometime in 1997 when they really needed to buckle down and get a demo ready for Nintendo's Space World event that same year. Before he got involved, Ocarina's development was in a bit of a mess, partly because there wasn't a clear chain of command. There were 5 equally ranked directors on the team. When Miyamoto came into the picture, he basically became the big boss and started making tough decisions, like helping the team work out what needed to be cut and what needed to be further developed. The 5 directors felt very strongly about Ocarina not being just an ordinary game, and put in lots of diverse dungeons, side quests, and mini-games. But Miyamoto felt that having so much stuff made everything too branched out and hard for players to understand. To make things more comprehensible, apparently, the team ended up adjusting the main plot to be more linear. As you might expect, this means Ocarina of Time has tons of unused ideas and cut content, which Miyamoto divulges in the interview. One of these ideas was that Kaepora Gaebora was going to have a split personality. When asked about why this didn't make the cut, Miyamoto replied, "We wanted to do that, but we wouldn't have had it ready in time for Christmas. If only we had another half a year." When Nintendo started making the game, they knew they wanted folks to be able to free play the game's titular Ocarina. However, until about halfway through development, they didn't have any solid ideas for using the Ocarina. If playing it actively made something happen, wouldn't that be more enjoyable than using some other item? But we were incredibly worried about players finding it annoying to play the Ocarina, and actually thought about including an automatic playing mode. But as we continued development, we gained more confidence in the Ocarina system and figured that everyone's gonna like this. As well as an automatic Ocarina mode, Nintendo also cut smaller details like a bed that hugged the player. Basically, when Link got in bed, it'd suddenly wrap around him. On top of being producer, Miyamoto had a few specific jobs on Ocarina, like writing a few characters like Kaepora Gaebora, and coming up with stuff for Lon Lon Ranch like Talon and Ingo. When Miyamoto first made Talon and Ingo, everyone on the team turned around and said, "You just made Mario and Luigi." So old Shigeru was like, "Whatever, I do what I want," and made them even more like Mario and Luigi. Miyamoto laments that he didn't have the time to flesh out the ranch more, and goes on to say, "Most of the characters there don't have any animations while they say their lines, but Ingo, who I worked on, does." But he moves with regret, like he realizes it's unfair only he does. Ingo was also supposed to become deranged and set the ranch on fire. Then Link'd have to open the stable fence to let the horses escape. Then he'd hop on Epona and ride away with Marin tucked under his arm, a herd of horses all running behind him, and Lon Lon Ranch burning down in the background. Miyamoto said, "People asked me, so what happens if you go back to the ranch later? Or can you get that many horses to move all together?" And so I had to give up. It's a scene where we didn't know what part of the game to put it in. After revealing that his favorite characters in the game are the Deku Scrubs, Miyamoto explains that the Scrubs actually fill the role of a character that was cut. The character's name would have been Hobbit, and he'd tell stories and sell items, among other things. But the team ran out of time and had to give all of Hobbit's roles to the Deku Scrubs. Although this would have been a cool Lord of the Rings reference, we think the game was better off for the cut in the end and helped build the identity of the Deku Scrubs.
As well as the interview, this issue of 64 Dream has a developer Q&A that's pretty interesting. The Miyamoto stuff is fresh, but this Q&A's already been translated online. It still has a few interesting points we want to mention though, so we're going to go over this first and throw in a few obscure Zelda tidbits we found during our research. One developer touches on some cut content. Boss programmer Kazuaki Morita brings up how in an earlier version of the game, players could fish in the Water Temple boss room. He says, "I came in to help at the halfway point. Making the fishing hole was difficult. At the time, you were able to fish inside the Water Temple boss room." Using a few other interviews and some observations from data miners, it seems after joining the team and seeing Morpha's boss room, Morita got the idea to add a fish swimming around the pool. Once he saw the fish swimming, he realized he could make a fishing minigame and decided to prototype it using existing assets. He made a fishing rod by modifying another model and reused Link's sword swing animation for casting the rod. Some evidence suggests this boss room fishing prototype was accessible using debugging tools. A leaked development commit log attributed to Morita instructs anyone who wants to see the secret work he was doing should set the variable SEX69 to 1. Then hold R and press L 6 times using controller 2, then load the boss area via map select. However, it appears that sometime between the date of the log entry and the game's release, Morita's secret fishing room was either cut out or written over. Our research led us to another piece of cut in-game content. During Ocarina's development, Nintendo of Europe's Madrid office initially planned for a full Spanish localization, but the effort was abandoned mid-production due to difficulties faced by the main developers in Japan. As a compromise, the Spanish release shipped using the English language ROM, but bundled alongside a 150-page booklet that showed all the game's text in both English and Spanish, so players could read it as they play. But constantly looking at a translation book while playing a game in another language was cumbersome, and even led to players accidentally reading spoilers while searching for specific lines. It got such a bad reception that the Spanish marketing for Majora's Mask heavily advertised that this game included a full in-game localization. And with that, let's get into that 64 Dream Miyamoto interview all about Ocarina of Time's development. In the decades since Ocarina of Time's release, fans have uncovered tons of early footage and cut content, but some of Ocarina's most curious cut content has been revealed directly by Miyamoto. Early in the interview, Miyamoto reveals to 64 Dream that Hyrule was actually planned to have a sea as well as a lake. He lamented there was supposed to be a giant lake on top of the northernmost mountain and a sea at the far south. So if you looked from the opposite direction, you'd see a massive cliff. The remains of that idea became the elevated portions of Gerudo Valley. During rough drafts, we had more cliffs, and I wish we could have had a lake or sea in with them. From here, Miyamoto references another scrapped location, a swamp area that was considered but left out to avoid technical complications. Miyamoto put a lot of thought into developing the game's atmosphere, and although Ocarina's world and feel were impressive for the time, old Shigeru only saw his failings. He told 64 Dream, "Even if it's just adding in some rocks, we want a game that feels dense, but there are a lot of things that feel lacking. Like, we couldn't make the wind feel truly real. The mood of the wind was something we put a lot of work into, but we weren't able to tie it into gameplay." He doesn't elaborate on what he meant by tying the wind into the gameplay, but it's interesting that this idea would be realized with the Wind Waker, and in a huge way. You can't help but wonder if this is where Wind Waker was born.
There's evidence suggesting that the forest and water temples in Ocarina of Time were originally wind and ice temples. The theory stems from the water medallion symbol resembling a snowflake and the forest medallion symbol resembling a fan. This theory is also supported by the interior design of Ganon's tower. The forest temple portion of the tower has a wind puzzle based around fans, and the water portion of the tower is based around ice. By using a GameShark code, it's possible to trigger lines of Japanese text in the item subscreen that read Ice Medallion and Wind Medallion. In issue 225 of Nintendo Power, it was revealed in an interview with Nintendo developer Yoshiaki Koizumi that the final boss battle with Ganon in Ocarina of Time was going to be very different. Ganon was originally gigantic, and Link would have to scale his massive body to deal blows similar to how you defeat bosses in Shadow of the Colossus. The idea was scrapped because of issues with the camera, as it could be confusing to the player because it never showed Ganon's entire body. Rendering the colossal Ganon at a steady frame rate would also have proven a strain on the N64's hardware. The concept was eventually reused in another Nintendo game, being the inspiration for the Super Mario Galaxy boss, Megaleg.
Did you know? Instead of using a magical conductor's baton, Link was originally planned to control the wind using a theremin. This alien-sounding instrument was accidentally invented by a Soviet radio engineer in 1920. Leon Theremin was trying to make something else entirely, but ended up with the world's first major electronic instrument. Instead of touching it, the musician leaves their hands floating above it. One hand controls the frequency, and the other controls the amplitude. But how exactly did this almost get into a Zelda game? A movie about Leon Theremin had just come out in Japan, about how he invented the instrument, traveled the world playing it, became a Soviet spy, and got thrown in the gulags. And it turns out that a few Nintendo devs saw the movie and thought, hey, that's an interesting story, let's have Link play a theremin in the next Zelda game. The game's title comes from the primary instrument, so up until halfway into development, the theremin itself was the Wind Waker. Aonuma and his team were all set with a Zelda game based around a theremin. Then Shigeru Miyamoto came in for playtesting and, as he tends to do, upended the tea table. According to Aonuma, he'd play what we made and point out what was weird. We had the Wind Waker item ready to some extent, when Miyamoto came to me shaking his head saying no, no, no. He talked about how it was entirely unacceptable. We were using both sticks at first, adjusting with both hands like how you play a theremin. By moving both hands like this, then the magazine notes that Aonuma aims his palms down and moves his hands up and down, you could change the sound. But eventually we changed it to the baton, and everything else fell into place from there. Miyamoto also changed Wind Waker's difficulty. It was initially harder, but a lot of Ocarina and Majora players got stuck on bosses and never got to experience the full game. So, to make sure everyone could reach the ending, Miyamoto toned down the difficulty, especially the bosses, compared to how the Zelda team originally had it set. When the HD remaster released a decade later, they added Hero Mode to compensate. But Aonuma said even though he's the director, this new mode was too hard even for him. He got stuck on Goma and gave up, then asked his team if the difficulty he was experiencing was some sort of bug, and they were like, no. Another aspect that Miyamoto wasn't keen on was Wind Waker's art style. Initially, Nintendo was just going to improve on the graphics from Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, and they even built a prototype in that style. But later on in the conceptual phase, the Zelda team's artist proposed Toon Link. The rest of the team loved it, and dove headfirst into the cel-shaded art style. Aonuma didn't think Miyamoto would like it, so he waited till they were already in pretty deep to show it to him. And he was right. Miyamoto literally cringed and didn't think it would sell. In early builds shown to the public, Link's eyes were solid black, but a fan from Europe sent in a letter saying black eyes made Europeans uncomfortable. In response, Miyamoto said, his eyes would change between 7 different colors. We made it so his eyes were temporarily red in battle, then blue when he calms down, and green when he's talking to people, and things like that. But ultimately we realized a human with red eyes is kind of creepy, isn't it? So at that point, we just decided to give up on the idea. Probably the biggest changes in development were for the sea itself. According to Aonuma, we wanted to do away with the Hyrule we'd had so far. We didn't want to just remake the same Hyrule from the N64, so what could we do? How about we just sync the whole thing? At first, we had plans for primary and alternate worlds like A Link to the Past, where you could go back and forth between present and past Hyrule, but we couldn't make something like that in the limited time we had. In A Link to the Past, you can warp back and forth between the Light World, where most of the game takes place, and a dark, twisted version of Hyrule called the Dark World. Wind Waker would have used a similar mechanic, but instead of the Dark World, Link would have explored underwater Hyrule. This concept art in the Hyrule Historia gives us a better look at how they were thinking that might have worked, with Link using a key item to warp down to the lower world. To get back to the upper world, Link would have grabbed onto hooks belonging to fishermen who'd yank him up back to the surface. They also wanted to make the ocean a lot smaller, but according to Aonuma, part of the reason the sea's so vast is because if we made it smaller, there wouldn't be enough time to process the data for whatever island you were heading towards. We had to strike a good balance with the boat's speed for the same reason. In the middle of development, we wanted to make the boat go faster, but doing that meant the game couldn't read all the data, and it froze a lot. As a result, the ocean ended up bigger than they wanted, and some fans thought getting from island to island took too long, which is why they eventually added a swift sail in the HD remaster. In the final game, if you reach the edge of the ocean, the boat says you can't go any farther and forces you to U-turn. But the Zelda team originally thought of making the ocean continuous to simulate the world being round, like how the world works in Skies of Arcadia, a Dreamcast game that launched while Wind Waker was in its planning stage. That way, if you sail off the right side of the map, you'd suddenly appear on the left side, or if you keep going up, you'll come out at the bottom. But they ended up scrapping that idea for story purposes. Wind Waker was brand new when this magazine interview took place, so the developers didn't want to reveal too much about the plot. But they did say you'll understand why they didn't make the world round when you see the game's ending. They're probably alluding to Wind Waker's final moments, when Link and Zelda sail off into the distance, looking for a land that'll become the next Hyrule. If the game's ocean was round and continuous, that would have implied the game world was in the entire world, meaning Link and Zelda would never find the land they were looking for. In other words, a cool gameplay concept was scrapped for the sake of the story. Aonuma says the very last thing they were working on when the clock struck midnight was the crabs. In the final game, they're tiny and don't really do anything except run away and dig into the sand. But the Zelda team wanted to make them 10 times their normal size and much more interactive. Nintendo Dream Magazine makes a point of Aonuma's regretful tone as he tells them, "We were going to have crabs on the shore and do lots of things with them, but in the end we couldn't make it happen. We were thinking about what to do with the crabs when development ended. Sorry about the crabs." He also laments how the boat turned out. In the final game, if you're on the boat, equipping the bombs makes a cannon appear, and the grapple hook turns into a crane for dredging up treasure. But Aonuma says they wanted to add a lot more tools for the boat, but didn't have enough time. Previous Zelda games always had a nice variety of mini-games, like the shooting gallery and bomb chew bowling. The team wanted to add some into Wind Waker too, like an island where Link can play golf. Unfortunately though, time was so tight that Aonuma had to give the order to abandon the idea. But as they were nearing the deadline, they came into the office one morning and were shocked to see the golf island somehow appeared out of nowhere. Aonuma said someone must have snuck in after hours and built it themselves, without anyone else on the team knowing. Sadly though, a lot of other mini-games weren't so lucky, and along with 2 entire dungeons, ultimately got left out of the final game. According to Aonuma and Haruhana, the Deku Leaf was originally a paper fan. Its only purpose was fanning things, but later in development they came up with the idea for Link to use it to fly around in the wind, so they changed it into a leaf. But these aren't the only secrets we dug up on Wind Waker, so let's jump right in with a roundtable interview we translated all about Wind Waker from Japan's Nintendo Online magazine, their January 2003 issue to be exact. The next part of the interview centers on Aonuma and Toshiaki Suzuki, who led development on Wind Waker's GBA connectivity and the Tingle Tuner. Partway through Wind Waker's development, Aonuma realized he wouldn't be able to finish the main game if he spent much time on GBA connectivity, so he brought Suzuki in to take the reins. After the introduction, Aonuma jumps straight into a bunch of tidbits we've never heard before, like how the Tingle Tuner concept came from Miyamoto saying, "Zelda's a single-player game, but dads want to play too, right?" Aonuma continued, "That stuck in the back of my mind, and I wondered if we could actually make something like that. Then I heard about the Game Boy Advance and GameCube's connectivity. That's when I came up with a plan for how dads and kids could play together. There was actually a point when I thought about making this a major part of the game, but that would mean you couldn't enjoy it if you didn't own a GBA, so we settled on the balance we have now." They elaborate on this a little more, and seem to say they wanted to let folks control Link on the overworld map using the GBA from the beginning. and the focus on maps made them start thinking about Tingle, since he's a map merchant in Majora's Mask. Then Aonuma says, "At first we envisioned it as walking around holding Tingle inside the GBA like an insect cage, but Tingle's a character with a lot of popularity within Nintendo. Ultimately, we expanded his role to appear in the main game too, and eventually to the point that Tingle has his own island in the main game."
The Wind Waker was planned to feature a cloud-riding frog that would serve as a guide, similar to Ocarina of Time's Navi. The idea to use a dedicated guide character was dropped, and the frog design was repurposed for Zephos and Cyclos. There were also unused guide designs for a cat and an acorn with a face. Nintendo wanted Link to carry another character through dungeons before Medley's character even existed. They also wanted any assisting character to fly, but they didn't want them to fly too well and make exploring the dungeons trivial. Because of this design choice, they considered having Link accompanied by a Rito that was too fat to fly properly, but they ultimately settled on Medley. Makar was originally planned to be used as a flotation device that allowed Link to walk on water. Link was also going to be able to hookshot and pull himself towards Makar. Since Makar can fly to places out of Link's reach, this would help the player traverse the Wind Temple. The developers felt bad for Makar, however, so he was given the ability to scatter seeds and grow trees that the player could hookshot onto. The Wind Waker's story may have had a greater connection with Ocarina of Time. The game has unused concept art for an adult Link, and although a static statue of an older Link appears in Hyrule Castle, these concepts show an adult Link in various action poses. Some concepts even show Link facing off against Ganon, and there are concepts of Link's progression from child to an adult. This could suggest Link was planned to change over time, similar to in Ocarina. Just as there was a DS island in Phantom Hourglass, Wind Waker was planned to have a GC or GameCube island. It never made it into the game, and the only reference to it can be found in the Hyrule Historia. There's also an unused area called Stovepipe Island, which was an island of steam and smoke with a hot spring lake and a valley of magma. There's more evidence of cut features within the game itself. A pair of wearable boots labeled water boots can be hacked back into the game. Link can equip the boots, which plays the same animation used for equipping the iron boots. It's speculated that the player would have used the water boots to sink below the surface, similar to in Ocarina of Time. The game also has several unused test rooms containing pools of translucent water. The translucent water might have been used so that players could see themselves move and interact with other objects under the water. This would give more weight to the sinking water boots hypothesis. Two unused sail icons can also be found in the game. Both use the sail design seen in the final game, but are named Zora Sail and the Tingle Sail. In an interview with MTV, Aonuma stated that the boat speed in the GameCube version of Wind Waker was limited by the console's hardware capabilities. In the Wind Waker HD, Nintendo included the Swift Sail to make traversing the overworld faster. At least one of the unused sails may have been planned to serve this function. Two dungeons were cut from the final version of the game so that Nintendo could complete the game on time. The two dungeons were replaced with the infamous Triforce Fetch Quest. Some fans hoped the missing dungeons would be included in the Wind Waker HD. Aonuma commented on the matter, saying, "I'm aware that a lot of users wanted those two missing dungeons to be implemented in the Wind Waker HD, but to be honest, we've already used those two dungeons for other titles after the Wind Waker already. So right now, technically, they don't really exist anymore." This might explain why Twilight Princess had a larger number of dungeons than usual. And
another interesting bit on Wind Waker is that there's an unused audio file for the water spirit Jaboon. The file makes it sound like Jaboon is wailing in pain. We know that Ganondorf tries to kill Jaboon, so this audio file could be from an earlier build of the game where Ganondorf was successful in killing Jaboon, or at least managed to hurt him.
Did you know? The late Satoru Iwata wanted to make a pre-order bonus disc for Twilight Princess. Years earlier, Wind Waker racked up over 500,000 sales before launch, breaking the record for the most pre-ordered game ever. This was in no small part thanks to the Master Quest bonus disc, which was such a strong incentive that many fans pre-ordered just for the disc and then cancelled their pre-order. This led Nintendo to bundle the Master Quest and the Wind Waker together when it later launched in Europe. After the GameCube lost the 6th generation console war to the PlayStation 2 and Xbox, Nintendo was desperate to make the Wii a success. And with Twilight Princess as its flagship launch title, a pre-order bonus disc would have been a shrewd business move. 8 months before launch, an interviewer asked Zelda director Eiji Aonuma if there would be a Wind Waker-style bonus disc, to which he responded, "With the size of the game, it may have to. We are currently considering adding a second disc as a bonus, but this is yet to be finalized. I think Mr. Iwata is keen for this to happen, but we shall see." Electronic Gaming Monthly magazine announced the details. For a $10 deposit, fans would get a copy of The Wind Waker visually remade with the graphics of Twilight Princess, and with the 2 dungeons Miyamoto said were cut due to Wind Waker's hasty production. It sounded too good to be true, and unfortunately, it was. It was EGM's sick idea of an April Fool's prank. The unfortunate reality was Nintendo never actually got around to making a pre-order bonus. Despite being one of the most expensive series to develop, Zelda sales have been steadily on the decline ever since Ocarina of Time. Japanese players were becoming less interested in video games in general, and Wind Waker didn't sell nearly as much in America as Nintendo expected. They were originally planning on making Wind Waker 2, but the situation was so dire, they decided their best hope of saving the franchise from extinction was to cancel it and develop an American Zelda instead. As Aonuma explained it, "I began to worry whether Wind Waker 2, which used a similar cel-shaded art style, was something that would actually sell. We knew what a challenge it would be to develop something that would sell in the Japanese market, where gamer drift was happening. That's when I decided that if we didn't have an effective and immediate solution, the only thing we could do was give the healthier North American market the Zelda they wanted. We knew that we would have to create a Zelda game that would live up to the expectations of fans in North America, and that if we didn't, it could mean the end of the franchise." Ocarina of Time was incredibly popular in America, so they switched the art style and initially considered making Ocarina's direct sequel. To quote Aonuma directly, it would have taken place some years later. The art department sketched Link so he looked 25 to 30 years old, but the overseas staff vetoed the designs and told them fans didn't want to play as an old Link. The Zelda team ultimately decided that instead of an older version of Ocarina Link, they'd use a totally different Link that was 16 or 17, and instead of a few years, it would take place a few decades after Ocarina. And because it wasn't too far in the future, some of the characters from Ocarina might still be alive in Twilight Princess. In a later interview, Aonuma made a couple of references to Navi providing feedback to the player, so it seems she was one of the characters planned to make a return. It certainly would have given the team a chance to tie up some loose ends after Navi's mysterious departure in the final moments of Ocarina. But at Miyamoto's request, Midna was created mid-development, so Wolf-Link wouldn't be so boring to look at from behind. Midna then gradually became a more central character as development continued, so it seems she eventually took Navi's place as Link's navigator. It can't be said with certainty that's why Navi got axed, but it ultimately became a moot point when the Zelda team decided to push the timeline back even further. In the final build, Twilight Princess was changed to take place 1 century after Ocarina, so instead of appearing in the flesh, Ocarina's characters are merely referenced, like King Zora, whose grave can be found in Kakariko's graveyard, and a black and white picture of the fishing hole man kept by his descendant Hina.
Did you know? While Breath of the Wild attempted to retain the feeling of discovery and exploration from previous games, it also changed many of the series' conventions. Brainstorming sessions and pitches led to 2 unused game ideas: Hyrule Wars, which featured Link running between 2 massive armies, and The Legend of Zelda Invasion, which featured an alien presence that would abduct cattle. Breath of the Wild was the first Zelda game to be developed in HD from the ground up. Nintendo created demos of Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, and Skyward Sword running on Wii U development kits to help them settle on a graphical style. The Wind Waker stood out to Nintendo, and they opted to give Breath of the Wild cel-shaded graphics. While cel-shaded graphics were kept for Breath of the Wild, the Wind Waker's intense use of it was dropped. The team thought that an overly cartoony art style might drive away older players and wouldn't allow them to create the realism that they wanted. Another idea from Treehouse staff was to use crabs in the game's cooking mechanic. Early in development, crabs were used to make elixirs instead. Localizer Nate Bidorf convinced Breath of the Wild's director to use them in food recipes instead, explaining simply that people love eating crabs. Concept art was shown at the Game Developers Conference panel in 2017 that showed Link in a tracksuit, with a guitar, in a spacesuit with a Metroid, and on a motorcycle. The art team never envisioned these ideas making it into the final game and used them only as an exercise to defy Zelda traditions. That said, the motorbike was later added to Breath of the Wild as DLC. The team found it difficult to make Link's distinctive hat look appealing and felt that they'd run out of ways to make it look cool after Skyward Sword. They experimented with all manner of designs for Link, including a few European-inspired designs and even an older Link whose arm was replaced with Sheikah technology. Eventually, they decided to alter Link's default look entirely, as the player would be changing clothes throughout the game anyway. The Guardians were also one of the first designs made for the game. They were based on Eiji Aonuma's impression of the Octoroks from the original Legend of Zelda. He imagined them to be much larger than how they appeared later in the series, and based the Guardians on that interpretation. However, the team gave them a mechanical look, as a huge octopus enemy would be, quote, kind of gross. Development took so long that Nintendo decided to release Breath of the Wild on the Switch alongside the Wii U. Differences in the two systems' hardware resulted in less emphasis on the gamepad in the Wii U version. However, Aonuma felt that focusing on a single screen made for a smoother overall experience. When the game was first shown, some fans speculated that the new incarnation of Link was female. Though this was never intended, the rumor sparked an internal discussion of a female Link, with Aonuma even consulting Zelda creator Shigeru Miyamoto on the idea. Aonuma also implied that the dialogue started by fans, as well as many female heroes in Hyrule Warriors, opened the possibility for a female protagonist in future Zelda games. Although some have criticized the game for its minimal use of music, Breath of the Wild was planned to have little to no music in any of the overworld. The team eventually decided to include music in important areas and villages so players would immediately know that they'd found something noteworthy. Interestingly, many scenes were originally going to remain text only. Only major cutscenes were planned to be voiced, but Nintendo ultimately decided to dub all of the game's cutscenes. Voice acting was also a contentious subject during development, with some wanting no voices at all. This was partly because devs wanted a silent Link so that players could easily project themselves onto the character. They also thought that it'd be strange if Link was silent while everyone else was talking, but this turned out to be far less jarring in practice. Due to the game's scope, several features had to be cut during production. The game originally had tiny people, similar to the Minish from the Minish Cap, and Link was even planned to shrink down and interact with these tiny people. However, the team thought they already had a distinct lineup of unique races and people for the game, and opted to scrap this idea. An unused line of text in the game states that the Master Sword has returned to the forest. It normally goes unseen, but can still be triggered in-game. This is done by exploiting a glitch that causes the Master Sword to disappear from the player's inventory. The text seems to imply that it was possible to drop or lose the Master Sword at some point in development.
Until halfway into development, Link could stab a sword into a rock face while climbing to take a break and regain stamina, but Miyamoto said the mechanic was ridiculous, as people can't realistically stand on top of a sword. Fujibayashi was aware that the game was already full of unrealistic fantasies, like how lightning isn't actually attracted to metal, wind from a Korok leaf couldn't really push a sail, and even Link's glider was unrealistic. But in the end, Miyamoto was the boss, so the rock stabbing technique got cut. Initially, Fujibayashi considered including up to 120 items in Breath of the Wild. He came up with a list of original items, as well as every item from previous Zelda titles, like the hookshot. He told IGN, "In the early stages of development, we actually do some tests with double hookshots and just being able to kind of go anywhere, like Spider-Man. Your mobility and your speed was just kind of incredible. There's lots of fans in the staff, even at pretty high levels, who really like the hookshot and they kept bugging me about it. I eventually just had to say, no, there will be no hookshot in this game. Breath of the Wild is all about doing new things." Ultimately, he decided less is more, and whittled Link's arsenal down to just 4 Sheikah runes, although some items ended up being repurposed as weapons, like the boomerang and the Korok leaf. The last item added to the game was Cryonis, adapted from the Sand Rod from A Link Between Worlds. Probably the strangest item that went unused was the Spy Drone. Alongside magnesis and remote bombs, official concept art shows a device that pops out of the back of the Sheikah Slate and folds into a drone shaped like a dragonfly, similar to how the Sheikah Slate summons the motorcycle. According to concept art, the drone had a rotating camera on the bottom, which presumably would have set the camera's perspective to the Sheikah Slate, as well as to the Wii U gamepad. Just like Link's Dragonfly, AR drones were controlled with a tablet or smartphone, had a bottom-mounted camera, and sent live video directly into users' hands. Having a drone could have allowed Link to scout hard-to-reach locations, solve puzzles, or just have fun pestering animals or skimming the water's surface. The Dragonfly drone would have been perfect for the Wii U's unique hardware, with Link's point of view appearing on the TV screen while the drone's perspective appeared on the gamepad, with touch controls used to change camera direction. In the game's final build, players collect resources to convert an empty slice of Hyrule into a quaint village called Tari Town, but despite being a fan favorite, Tari Town was actually a much less ambitious version of its original concept, which would have allowed players to customize their creations any way they wanted. In other words, a little more Animal Crossing and a little less fetch quest. According to Eiji Aonuma, originally we wanted to make something players can build on their own. The backside of that story is actually when we were creating Breath of the Wild, the planners wanted a part of the game that could use game design tools and not rely on the programmers, so that's how Tari Town and also the house came about. In Creating a Champion, an art book that describes lots of ideas changed in development, lead structural artist Manabu Takehara appears to be providing more details on that original concept, and seems to imply that houses could be constructed all across Hyrule, rather than restricted to one small area. He says, These square rooms are simply stacked together and locked into place. Then you can add a wooden deck or flower bed in whatever way you choose. They can be freely and easily arranged as well. Of course, they are easy to break down and can be transported later as you see fit. Will Bolson be able to rebuild Hyrule with his innovative stacked construction? Speaking of animals, concept art also shows 6 unused divine beasts, like a manta ray and submarine-themed whale, who it's probably safe to assume were planned for Hyrule's ocean, and this giant mechanical crab was probably meant for a beach environment. There was also a brontosaurus surrounded by lightning, which is fitting since brontosaurus is actually a Greek word meaning thunder lizard, possibly considered for an area that's always storming, like Thundra Plateau. A land-walking jellyfish appears to be based on the tripods from War of the Worlds, and another is possibly based on a chimera from Greek mythology, which are usually depicted as lion-goat hybrids with a snake for a tail, or it could be a Brazilian headless goat, a legendary creature with flames instead of a head. Even the champions could have been different. In place of Revali, concept art shows a whip-wielding Kokiri champion, suggesting an entire village like Kokiri Forest was considered as well. Did you know? Some of the Minish Cap's unused content also references other games. There are 3 unused stained glass windows. These were originally meant to be part of Hyrule Castle, and depict Valu, Jabun, and the Great Deku Tree from Wind Waker. Similarly, the 3 Goddess Pearls from Wind Waker also exist within the game, but are left unused. It's unclear whether they would have played a significant role in the game. Some regional differences also hint at unused content. The description for the Ice Wizrobe figurine in the European game says, "They're weak against fire, so hit them with your fire rod." There's no fire rod in the final game. However, there is a fire rod in the game's data.
We recently translated an interview from the 124th issue of the Japanese magazine Nintendo Dream. This issue featured an interview about The Legend of Zelda: The Minish Cap between Eiji Aonuma, who acted as the game's supervisor, and Hidemaru Fujibayashi, who directed the game over at Capcom, and who would ultimately join Nintendo to work on future Zelda games. The interview has some interesting facts that have never been posted anywhere else. Minish Cap's Hyrule Town is a fairly dense and bustling area in the center of the game's world, which led to the interviewer asking if Hyrule Town was inspired by Majora's Mask Clock Town. But Aonuma shot that down by saying, no, it's its own thing. But immediately after, Fujibayashi follows up by saying, we had talked about making a game that stays just in town for a while. Interestingly, Fujibayashi said earlier in the interview that they originally wanted Link to wear all kinds of different masks and hats, but this was reduced in scope to Link having a single hat that could talk. So the Minish Cap was originally a game that made players stay in a central town for a while and had tons of different masks to wear. Sounds like in its early stages, Minish Cap was more like a 2D Majora's Mask.
Did you know? Development of A Link to the Past started long before the Super Nintendo released and took about 3 years to complete. The idea to return to a top-down perspective was something Zelda creator Shigeru Miyamoto had been planning for years. In fact, he decided the third Zelda would be top-down even before work began on Zelda 2: Adventure of Link. Miyamoto also planned to include a party of characters in A Link to the Past, an elf fighter hybrid, a magical fairy, and a girl. This fairy character would have done reconnaissance instead of fighting, but the fairy was ultimately brought forward and used in Zelda 2 instead. In some cases, there's concept art for elements that were left out of Link to the Past. Some concept art for Zelda shows her in futuristic attire. When the original Legend of Zelda was being developed, it was planned for the fragments of the Triforce to be electronic chips, and the entire game overworld would have existed in both the past and the future, with Link being the link between the two times. This concept art could be an indication that Nintendo wanted to revisit the idea and explain why A Link to the Past has multiple worlds. Speaking of which, early in production, the team toyed with the idea of having 3 overworlds in the game instead of 2. However, they feared that 3 worlds might overcomplicate the gameplay and be difficult to implement. There was another story element planned for the game. At one point, the story would have involved the world ending when a large egg cracked at the top of a mountain. Sound familiar? This idea was later used in Link's Awakening for the Windfish and its egg at Tall Tall Heights. There were several other elements planned for Link to the Past. One new addition to the series was that Link could walk diagonally. The team originally had Link swinging his sword while facing these diagonal directions as well, but sword swinging didn't feel right at an angle. Diagonal sword attacks were removed, and the team came up with the spin attack to fill their place. use. The team also planned for wildfires to sweep across a patch of grass if the player lit them with the lantern, an idea that was eventually used in Four Sword Adventures. The team also wanted to add the ability to dig a ditch with a shovel and bomb the edge of a body of water to expand it. At one point, the player also had to go around testing walls to see if they were destructible. If the player hit a wall with their sword and heard a hollow sound, the wall could be brought down with a bomb. By itself, this mechanic proved to be too cryptic, and small cracks were added to indicate that walls could be broken. There are a few complete elements in the game's data that, for whatever reason, weren't implemented in the final version. There's a fully programmed but unused enemy in the game that holds a cannon. This cannon soldier will fire in the general direction of the player and, when knocked back after taking a hit, will walk to the position they started in. Unlike other blue soldiers, they take 2 hits to kill instead of 3. There's also an unused skull statue that was intended to appear in the Skull Woods dungeon but can only be viewed by glitching or hacking the game. Interestingly, the statue's design seems to have been reused in the background of Yarna Desert in Link's Awakening. When A Link to the Past was re-released for the Game Boy Advance, the graphic appeared in a new bonus dungeon called Palace of the Four Sword.
And now on to the next game we're going to talk about, Zelda, a disk drive expansion to Ocarina of Time that met a similar fate as Zelda Super FX. Zelda's been covered by countless other YouTube channels already, but a lot of them are filled with rumors and half-truths. We managed to dig up some new information on what was real and what wasn't. The week Ocarina hit store shelves, Miyamoto told Next Gen magazine, Ocarina of Time was designed with the introduction of the DD in mind. Every Ocarina cartridge was manufactured with the expectation that Zelda was already on the way and millions of players were going to connect it to their Ocarina carts. In that same interview, Miyamoto goes on to say, there were several ideas I could not incorporate into Zelda because of the lack of time and various other factors. For example, I wanted to create some extra dungeons and challenges for those who had completed the quest, and we planned them for the predicted introduction of the DD. One feature in particular that Miyamoto wanted to do in Ocarina but couldn't was connectivity features with the Game Boy. Talking to Japanese magazine 64 Dream, he said Majora's Mask would not let players create custom masks, but hinted they might be able to do so in Zelda by using the Game Boy camera together with Mario Artist. But we weren't sure if that stuff actually got worked on or if it was just an early idea Miyamoto threw out there willy-nilly in a couple of interviews. Lucky for us, tons of N64 development assets dropped in the 2020 GigaLeak. We wanted to dig through them and check for mask customization in Zelda, but frankly it's a lot more complicated than we're equipped to handle. So we talked to Luigi Blood, an Ocarina of Time modder and 64DD enthusiast who'd already spent countless hours digging through all that leaked data. Basically, he told us that Ocarina's assets showed it was compatible with Mario Artist, just like Miyamoto talked about. That compatibility was removed from Ocarina's retail release, but Luigi Blood noted, they also mess with masks during Zelda development. There are traces where they seemingly wanted to do something with the Gerudo mask and Keaton mask. Unfortunately, I don't know what for, as the disk source code is not present in the GigaLeak, only the base information and make files. All I can see is that the disk side code keeps track of the model file location, possibly to replace the mask files. Another interesting feature Miyamoto talked about was an online component. In the August 98 issue of Nintendo Power, having just finished making Ocarina, Miyamoto said, "We've already talked about a network Zelda as an interesting idea. The assistance of other players in the network could motivate a player's active participation instead of the traps or secrets that I create." But again, we weren't sure if those network features actually got worked on. We checked with Luigi Blood, but he said there weren't any traces in the GigaLeak. But the leak was incomplete and missing lots of data, so network features not being in there didn't necessarily mean they weren't in development. Fortunately, Miyamoto wasn't alone in that Nintendo Power interview. There were 3 other Zelda developers, one of them being a very young Giles Goddard. Giles was the first non-Japanese programmer to ever work for Nintendo, basically because Nintendo couldn't find anyone in Japan who could match his whiz-kid programming skills. We tracked him down to ask some questions about the old days. We talked for half an hour about various projects, and toward the end, we read him the quote from his interview with Miyamoto in 1998. Here's his response.
Do you recall any specifics regarding work on this network Zelda that have never made their way into a finished Zelda game?
Yes. And I want to stay alive, so I'm not gonna say what.
Giles wasn't willing to share any details beyond the fact that they did work on those network features that were never made public, and that they were, and still are, top secret. But just knowing Network Zelda was more than empty chatter was interesting in itself. Miyamoto saying players would replace his traps and secrets kinda sounds like a dungeon builder, where you could design your own dungeons and share them online. We went looking for evidence, but eventually realized that wasn't the correct interpretation when we found a German magazine where Miyamoto specifically said no, there won't be a dungeon builder. Interestingly though, he does describe a different dungeon system than the static remixes that made their way into Master Quest. Instead of simply remixing dungeons, he said they were going to be randomized, randomized. The Germans asked what'll make Ura different from Ocarina, and Miyamoto said simply put there will be a random element. Every time you go into a dungeon, the composition will be different. For example, if a treasure chest was in a certain place the first time you entered the dungeon, it won't be there the next time, but will be in a completely different location. Then he says there won't be a dungeon builder or something like an online versus mode, but because of the 64DD's read and write capabilities, they're thinking about new downloadable dungeons and sharing other data with players. That seems to line up with what he told a Mexican magazine a couple months later, that there's a potential for hundreds of dungeons. Both of these interviews were in late 1999 though. By then, it seems Miyamoto had already given up on adding new features outside of Hyrule's dungeons. That's because at that point, Ura Zelda had already been neutered in favor of Majora's Mask due to Eiji Aonuma thinking Ura wouldn't make a worthy sequel. Then he and most of the Ocarina team broke off to work on Majora's Mask, leaving a much smaller team left to work on Ura. Even Miyamoto, originally the driving force behind the expansion, abandoned it to focus his attention exclusively on Majora's Mask. With most of its resources stripped, all of those earlier ideas about custom masks, network features, and new story elements fell by the wayside. And that's how Ura Zelda became Master Quest. Instead of an ambitious expansion, it was downgraded to a second quest with remixed dungeons. In a few interviews, Miyamoto teased the idea of releasing Ocarina with remixed dungeons as a $20 N64 cartridge, but by the time Ura's development wrapped up in June of 2000, the GameCube was right around the corner, so they threw it in as a Wind Waker pre-order incentive, and the rest is history.
Did you know? The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask actually has voice commands programmed into the game, and they still work. On March 1st, 2018, Nintendo 64 ROM hacker Zoinkity found voice commands programmed into the original Japanese release of the game. Just a day later, Zoinkity discovered the voice commands were programmed into all versions of Majora's Mask, including the GameCube re-releases. For years it was known that Majora's Mask's debug menu mentioned support for the voice recognition system add-on, but there'd been no proof the game ever actually used it until now. It appears a single byte of data is the only thing stopping the VRS from working. Once changed in the ROM, commands can be spoken into the voice recognition system just as they can in Hey You Pikachu. The commands are in Japanese in all versions. Okiro, Japanese for wake up, can be used to wake up Deku Scrubs. Ato Nanjikan, or how many hours left, can be asked of the Sheikah stones to tell the player the time. Then there's milk, which allows the player to gather twice as much milk from cows. Ocarina of Time also had many obscure features that were changed before the final release. In 1997, Miyamoto was interviewed by Japan's Famimaga 64 magazine, and revealed several details about Ocarina of Time that were different to the final game. Originally, Link would have had his speed slowed down as his health depleted. Only adult Link would have been able to use magic. Link would have been able to use staves as weapons, and Link would have been able to dash by pressing the B button when the game prompted it. The 3 spiritual stones were also intended to slot into the ocarina, which had 3 holes for this purpose. Miyamoto even said Shadow Link wouldn't be in Ocarina of Time, as it was a last-minute addition to Zelda 2. He also suggested that there'd be multiple horseback enemies, but the only enemy who rides a horse in the final game is Phantom Ganon. The Gerudo Fortress isn't accessible to Link when he's a child. However, an extra piece of heart can be found above Link's cell while in child form, and can only be obtained via cheats or glitches. The treasure chest that contains a piece of heart for adult Link instead holds an odd mushroom during the child era. Both of these discoveries imply that the fortress was originally explorable by child Link, and these objects can even still be found in the 3DS remake of the game. Among Nintendo's staff, Miyamoto is known to upend the tea table, meaning he demands large changes to a game towards the end of development. Aya Kyogoku, who was in charge for the overall script and some events for Twilight Princess, said players originally only spent 1 day in Ordon Village, the first location of the game. Kyogoku said, "Out of the blue, it was decided to make it 3 days. We got a sheet of paper with a specification plan written on it, a kind of Miyamoto-san's 3-day plan." According to Kyogoku, the team received the paper late in development, right after E3. The reason seemed to boil down to the Wii version of Twilight Princess not giving players much time to adapt to the radically new control scheme. If players only spent a small amount of time there before heading to more difficult parts, they might might feel unprepared and get frustrated. Still, the effect of the decision was abrupt and intense. Programming, positions of characters, field design, all of the lines spoken by characters, and even several items in the village were altered. Kyogoku had to tell the European and American localization teams that the village was going to be completely changed, and not to translate anything before the changes were finished. But then, right when the team was finishing up, the tea table was upended again when it was decided to put another event into the game's story. Despite this, the team managed to get everything finished in time for release, including the localization staff. Speaking of voice work, both Zelda the Wand of Gamelon and Link the Faces of Evil for the Philips CDI have unused audio warnings. The protagonists of both games will warn the player that the game disc might be dirty, and recommend cleaning it before continuing.
I think your game disc must be dirty. Try ending the game and cleaning your disc.
Did you know? Before the Zelda name was chosen, the first game was simply known as Adventure by Nintendo's internal staff. One of the ideas for the game took advantage of the Famicom Disk System's ability to rewrite data. Players could actually create their own dungeons and have another player solve them. Nintendo even tested the idea and found actually playing the dungeons to be fun and focused on that instead. There's a reoccurring event in the Zelda series where characters state variations of the phrase, "It's a secret to everybody." The phrase is in most Zelda games and is a reference to the original Legend of Zelda on NES, where a moblin says, "It's a secret to everybody," and then gives Link some rupees. In the pre-release prototype version of The Legend of Zelda, the text from the moblin actually reads, "Overlook it just this once." Originally, he was bribing you. Other Zelda games have also gone through drastic changes during development. In early versions of the first Legend of Zelda, the old man at the beginning would give the player a choice between the wooden sword and a boomerang to start the adventure with. In the debug menu of Majora's Mask, it's possible to access an unused cutscene of the Great Fairy physically training Link in new techniques as opposed to just magically granting them like in the final version. There's also an unused clock object in A Link to the Past. It's assumed that it was meant to be mechanically similar to the magical clock in the original Zelda, where all the enemies on the screen were frozen when it's touched. It probably went unused because of the Quake medallion, which achieves a similar effect, making it unnecessary. An early version of the Armos, named Armos Titan, can be found in the code of Twilight Princess. It's much more human-like and attacks by swinging its arms. There's also what appears to be an early model of the Shadow Beasts and a giant monster comprised of curled-up Gorons. As we can briefly see in this early trailer of the game, moblins were also planned to make an appearance. Did you know? Hyrule Warriors was going to be very similar to traditional Zelda titles with very few Dynasty Warriors elements. For example, it was planned to have full-blown boss battles with dungeons to explore. However, Zelda creator Shigeru Miyamoto saw this proposal and was very dissatisfied with its direction. He flipped the pitch, saying the game should be more of a Dynasty Warriors title with Zelda elements leading to the Hyrule Warriors we know today. In the Japanese version of Hyrule Warriors for the Wii U, there are several unused files relating to the game's early development. Several portraits from Dynasty Warriors 8 can be found, along with several assets relating to Tingle. This suggests that Tingle was originally planned to be a base game character, but was cut during development. In-game text and some code also exists for Tingle, but in nowhere near completed state. The code also suggests he would use his balloon as a weapon, which might suggest his DLC appearance in the Majora's Mask pack didn't differ too much from his original planned appearance. In an interview shortly after the game's release, it was revealed that Aonuma pushed back against the idea of Tingle being in the game. This was due to Western fans disliking the character and Aonuma wanting to prevent backlash and annoyance. Tingle wasn't the only character left on the cutting room floor. Linkle, initially a female alt of Link, was also proposed by Koei Tecmo early in development. The team gave her a sword at first, but later decided they wanted to use crossbows as a reference to Link's crossbow training on the Wii. Koei Tecmo had a difficult time deciding what role she would play, such as if she'd be Link's sister and what the implications of that would be. Koei Tecmo also spent a lot of time on the game's original characters, Lana and Sia. Originally, they weren't planned as sorceresses at all, but fairies. This was changed during development to flesh out the story and provide a reason as to why different universes were connected. The team also considered adding Wind Waker content to the original Hyrule Warriors. However, many thought Wind Waker differed too much visually from Twilight Princess, Skyward Sword, and Ocarina of Time. When Nintendo and Koei Tecmo decided to make a 3DS sequel, they chose to include a Wind Waker epilogue to the game's story. This wasn't the only story change in the Hyrule Warriors series, with Linkle's introduction in Hyrule Warriors All-Stars being more ambitious. Originally, the team envisioned Linkle wandering into the Temple of Souls. Girahim would present and would be placing a curse on Link. Darunia and Lana would then show up and start competing with Girahim in a dance-off to rescue Link. Linkle would approach the dancing group and try to put a stop to everything. However, when she got closer to Link, much to her horror, she discovered that it was actually Tingle. In the end, it would all be a dream.
Did you know? The very first piece of music you hear in the original Legend of Zelda was created in just one day. Originally, the team elected to use Bolero, a classical piece composed for a Russian ballet. But that piece of music's copyright hadn't expired yet. Zelda's development was entering its final stage and the game was being prepared for mass production. Because of this, the game's composer, Koji Kondo, had to make a new piece of music in just one night. The Bolero piece was selected because the tempo matched the speed of Zelda's opening sequence, and this tempo was used in the new arrangement as well. During development of Ocarina of Time, Zelda's creator Shigeru Miyamoto had to push to get a manually controlled ocarina in the game. I like international music such as Inca or Latin. I really wanted to put in an ocarina. It seemed really Zelda-esque. Playing an instrument is a much more enjoyable way to accomplish things than just casting a spell. There were people suggesting playing the ocarina is too tiresome, let's make it automatic. I was undecided as well, but when I went to examine the situation, I found the complainers were happily playing the ocarina too. Originally, a reed pipe was going to be used to summon Epona, Link's horse. But it didn't make sense to have two separate musical instruments once the ocarina was implemented, so it was switched out. Marilyn was originally going to stay in the ranch singing by herself and to the horses. Her story was changed halfway through so that once she was in the castle, she'd no longer sing. Majora's Mask, Pamela is named after lyrics from a bossa nova style song, which is probably why she and her father live in a music box house. Because of the Brazilian roots of the bossa nova music, Pamela was originally foreign, but her ethnicity was ultimately changed to Japanese.
If you want even more cut content trivia, check out our last video all about cut content from the Super Mario series. If you liked this video, give it a like and subscribe for more. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.